A federal court says it may not be able to rule on a lawsuit challenging a trans woman's membership in a sorority. Last year, 6 members of the Kappa Kappa Gamma sorority filed a lawsuit after a trans woman named Artemis Lanford joined their local chapter at the University of Wyoming. The lawsuit was thrown out because the judge believed he couldn't define what a woman is for this organization. Also believed the judge that he couldn't decide whether or not she belonged. The sorority sisters lawyer argued that the sorority council was unfair to sorority members by changing who could belong. And today, 3 judges in the U.S. 10th Circuit Court of Appeals heard arguments, but they have not issued a ruling. The University of Wyoming is the state's only 4-year public university. It's been thrust into the national spotlight because of this issue, as trans people fight for more acceptance inside of school activities. I gotta be honest with you, this is an issue that I want to learn more about and that I want to talk more about, because this doesn't land easily for me. If we begin from the premise that trans women are women, and I believe trans women are women, I believe trans men are men. If we begin from that place, then it seems like an obvious and uncontroversial move to say that a sorority admits women, that sorority has women. These are women. So, like, there's no problem here. But I think if we scratch beneath the surface and we have a more nuanced and complicated conversation that doesn't begin from a place of transphobia, that doesn't begin from a place of questioning the humanity or the legitimacy of trans people, we should ask some questions, right? Like, for example, are there experiences, are there spaces, are there practices, are there ideas, are there networks, are there communities in which cisgendered women or cisgendered men should be able to bond, right? Are there any experiences that cisgender people should be able to have independent of trans folk? Are there experiences that trans folks should be able to have independent of cis folk? This is a question. I'm not saying this is my answer. I'm asking, this is the question. And I think the problem is the people who are most committed to having that conversation are people who don't love trans people, people who don't honor or respect trans people. But if we, again, begin from a place of acknowledging and recognizing and affirming the humanity and the womanhood and manhood of trans people, respectively, if they so identify, then the question becomes more complicated to me. For example, I pledged a fraternity. I know what that's like, and I know what that experience is like. And there are things about that experience that, and I'm sorry, there's something in my eye. There's something about that experience that was deeply valuable. And it was about a certain kind of bonding experience with my brothers. Would I have cared if a trans man was in there? No, I would not have. I ain't gonna lie to you. I would not have cared. Not at all. I wouldn't have cared. Would they want to be in that space? Maybe not. But that says more about the toxic masculinity in fraternities than it does about the trans person. What I think more about is what it might mean for trans women. When a trans woman is in that space, is it simply transphobia? Is it simply transphobia if a trans woman is applying for membership to a sorority? Are there any legitimate issues that could be raised? Are there any legitimate questions that could be asked? Are there any legitimate concerns that we could be able to engage that aren't bound up in transphobia and trans antagonism? I don't know the answer to it. This is what I'm saying. I want to learn. I want to have this conversation. I want us to talk through it. And so I'm curious to know what you all think about it. I don't have an answer. I think this sorority raises the right question. I think this lawsuit raises the right question. Um, anyway, there's a longer conversation we can have right now, but um, somebody said, I want to take this question up now. Mark, can you think of any concerns outside of uncomfortable? Yeah, yeah, um, yeah. I think so. I think that there are questions for women around safety. I'm not suggesting that the trans woman is a threat, um, but there are other concerns around safety. One, so, it's hard to answer that question without talking about the sort of underground rituals of um, of fraternities and sororities that I don't feel comfortable doing in a public space. So it's not that I don't have an answer to that question, but um, I would have to talk about things that I don't talk about in public with regard to these organizations. So it's a complicated answer, and those who have pledged understand what I'm saying. I think, but particularly if you pledge a fraternity, I can't speak to sorority life because I never pledged a sorority, but I did pledge a fraternity. But I worry that these conversations often become reduced down to simply denying the manhood or the womanhood or even the fundamental humanity of trans folk, or it frames them as con artists or threats. It frames them as predators or interlopers, and I don't think that that's the right conversation or the healthy conversation. But I also think that we can't assume that anyone who has legitimate concerns about trans participation within certain cultural and social spaces um, is automatically being transphobic. I mean, I think there's a legitimate question that can be asked about what it means, for example, for a trans woman to participate in um, track and field or swimming or boxing. I mean, these are legitimate questions I think we have to ask around uh, biology, around um, around competition, around fairness, that I don't think are reducible to, you know, everybody's homophobic, transphobic, everybody is the same, everybody is um there's the problem is, again, so much of this conversation has been organized by people who are transphobic, right? There was like one trans person running track, and you had governors all around the country um making laws to protect women and girls, but it wasn't about protecting women and girls. Um it was about shaming, and it was a solution in search of a problem. It was like, how do we beat up on trans folk? How do we shame them? How do we mobilize voters to get to the polls and vote their fears and not their aspirations? So there's a way that I understand why these conversations are so weird, because they're not being had by the right people. But what about people who genuinely worry about the well-being of trans folk and want to affirm the humanity and womanhood of trans women, for example, but also think that there might be a competitive disadvantage of a trans woman running track or boxing or swimming? I don't think that that's a I don't think that's an inherently taboo conversation. It shouldn't be an inherently taboo conversation.